I think we're ready to start. Believe it or not, I am not in charge, which is rare around here, but every now and then we do things, and this lady to my right is in charge, but she's trying to make me feel like I'm in charge, so she asked me to welcome me here. So welcome. Let's give Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Coleman a round of applause for this conversation. I want our mayor to come and greet us, and then I'm going to say a word, and then I'm turning the mic over to Congresswoman Coleman. Mayor Kramer.
Well, I'm humbled to be on the stage with these two, and I'm sure I won't fare very well compared to them, but please give me a little grace here.
You're in the right place.
Welcome to Franklin, for those of you who don't live here, and welcome to Franklin for those of you who do. This is a very important meeting, and I'm very grateful for it, and really kudos to the Congresswoman for this meeting and the whole initiative. Black youth, male youth, 5 to 11 years old, over the last 3 decades, their suicide rate has increased by 89%. To compare it, at the same time, white youths of the same demographic have decreased by 67%. So why is that happening? Is it discrimination? Is it lack of availability to health care? Is it the pressures different for whites and blacks? Those are the kinds of things that have not been pulled out yet, at least I don't know that they have, and those are the kinds of things that need to be discovered so that we can stop this. This is a very important effort of the Congresswoman. I am thrilled that she chose Franklin to be a part of this, and I look forward to learning here with you tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor. I received a phone call a couple of months ago informing me that the Congressional Black Caucus was forming a task force to look at the issue of suicide among African American teenagers. In that call, I was also informed that my congresswoman and friend of many, many, many years would be the chair for the Congressional Black Caucus of that task force effort. And when they asked me to participate, what I told them was anything Bonnie Watson Coleman asks of me, I will always say yes. I remember back in the old days when I would run to Trenton to beat up on some cabinet member or some legislator, I would always stop by the Department of Community Affairs, and sitting in a small cubicle doing her job was Bonnie Watson. Her dad was a friend of mine, her family and I go way back, and she, from that time until now, has been a tireless advocate for anything that helps people that need help. And I am not surprised, but I am thrilled and honored that she's taken on this task and that she has begun the process of participation on the grassroots level right here in Franklin Township. Often y'all want to give me some applause for that? I'll give you too many though, because I'll get warmed up. Often what happens in Washington is that policymakers call on experts, and we do have some experts in the room today. But they limit their perspective to what experts say, and often experts become experts because they have read books written by other experts. And if you read enough books written by enough experts and you write good papers about those books, you can become an expert. And often the people who are closest to the problem, the people who are affected by the policies around the problem are not consulted. And so it's no surprise that this concept of having not only experts, but just normal people like you and me to talk to experts, listen, and give input and feedback to the policymakers is certainly appropriate for this subject. I just released a book called Say Yes When Life Says No, and it was motivated by my grandmother's church in Montclair back in the 50s and 60s that would break out in a one-word song more often than not, and that word was yes. And it was striking to me as a child to see my grandmother, who worked for rich people in Upper Montclair, and her cousin that worked for some rich people in Upper Montclair, and butlers and maids and truck drivers who all week long worked for minimum wage, who were denied their civil rights, who didn't have access to opportunities, but the theme song in their church on Sunday morning was yes. And it stuck with me that these people, when society said no, they had deep in their spirit the determination to say yes. When jobs were not available, God told them just say yes. And they said yes long enough to exact legislation that changed voting opportunities for our people. They said yes long enough for housing to be made available because of public policy. They said yes so long that their grandchildren organized an effort to elect a black president in this country. That's what happens when you say yes. Unfortunately, as the mayor said, this generation, although it is the generation of promise, this generation has all of what previous generations have prayed for and fought for. This generation seems to have lost the ability to say yes. And thus we find young people without hope, young people who are giving up on themselves, and young people who need a society to understand them and to serve them rather than judge them and condemn them. And so this conversation is critical. It's being led by one of the bright lights in Washington, a woman who really needs no introduction, but someone who tonight is simply extending her lifelong commitment to serving her people, her community, and young people in particular, Congresswoman Bonnie Watson Cole.
Because I want this to be conversational. I want to tell you a little bit about why we're here, and I want to tell you about what we call the Runner Show. So we are here because we, as the mayor had mentioned, thank you for doing your research, Mayor, we recognize that not only is there an uptick in suicide anyway, it is particularly devastating in terms proportionally to our black community, to our young black boys in particular, and to our girls. As a matter of fact, I looked at a Facebook posting just yesterday, and a 9-year-old boy who was bullied at school was found hanging from his closet by his sister. And apparently part of the bullying was, look, you need to die. And so I don't understand that phenomenon, how that gets into anybody's head and evokes that kind of response. So we have this emergency task force that includes a lot of professional and experts, academics, researchers, doctors, hospital executives, just all kinds of people who've been willing to work with us in a work group. And the work group is led by a Dr. Michael Lindsay, who was supposed to be here this evening, but he's a bit under the weather, so we pray for his quick recovery. And our plan for this task force is to not only have our various meetings down in Washington, but also other members of the task force are having a coming together gathering in their districts as well around this issue. As a matter of fact, Representative Omar Ilhan's having one at the end of August. If anybody's available to go out there to Michigan, she'd love to have you. So we're going to do about an hour and maybe hour and 20 minutes with the panel, and then we want to leave some time for you to ask questions, because we need to have conversations. We want to have conversations around the faith-based community. We want to have conversations with everyday parents. We want to have conversations with teachers, anybody who represents the front line, and parents and teachers and members of the clergy community certainly represent that to our community. So we have a very distinguished panel with us this evening, but before I do that, let me do what a politician does best. And that is to introduce those who've taken their time to be here with us today. I have my Assemblywoman, Valina Reynolds Jackson, Assemblywoman. I have Assemblywoman Linda Carter here. Of course, you've heard from the mayor, and then we have Councilman William Galtieri. Did I get the accent right? Thank you. Now I want to talk to you. I want to introduce you to this panel. Did you hear me leave? No. He does that. One of our members of our working group is here, someone that I've had a very long history with, worked in the legislature with. He's a doctor, lawyer, assemblyman. So he kind of covers a number of the areas. Assemblyman Dr. Herb Conaway is part of our working group. And he's been in the Assembly since 1998. He's the chairman of the Health and Senior Services Committee, and he's the only member of the legislature with both a medical degree and a law degree. And he has played a very significant role in all of the major health legislation that's been signed into law during his 12 years there. Dr. Conaway, I'm so glad to have him. And next, we have someone else that I have a very long sister history with. I'm the big sister, obviously. The older sister, much older sister. Micheline Davis is the Executive Vice President and Chief Corporate Affairs Officer for Robert Wood Johnson Barnabas Health, where she oversees policy development and governmental and external affairs. She was named among the top 25 most influential minority leaders in healthcare in the nation by Modern Healthcare magazine. Before joining Barnabas, she was a policy counsel to then Governor Corzine, John Corzine. Micheline Davis. Then we have Takia Blackman, is a mental health advocate, speaker, and author. She is the creator and host of the Fireflies Unite with Kia, a weekly podcast dedicated to sharing the stories of individuals thriving with mental illness within communities of color. As a peer recovery specialist, she develops plans to help clients reach their personal and professional goals. Takia. Then we have one of your own, Crystal Pruitt, Franklin Township's newest councilperson, also serves as Chief of Staff to Assemblyman Andrews Whitaker. I'll tell you, he's very fortunate. And she's also worked as a legislative liaison for the New Jersey Department of Human Services, but she has a very rich background in working in social work areas and working in this space, and we're delighted to have her. Thank you. Last but not least is Kimmy Carlos. She is a public speaker, mental health advocate, and nonprofit leader. She is the founder and executive director of the Urban Mental Health Alliance, and she's also a certified health and wellness coach with the Institute for Integrative Nutrition and a number of several nonprofit boards, including that of Children's Future at the Center for Family, Community, and Social Justice, the National Alliance on Mental Illness of Mercer County, where she's a certified facilitator. Our discussion today is going to be moderated by the very talented Brittany Jean Lewis. Brittany is a mental health therapist and advocate that has been working with adolescents, women, and families for over 11 years. She is the owner and the founder of A Free Man's Place Counseling, a group counseling agency offering individual, family, group, and substance abuse counseling. It works to ensure that those from lower socioeconomic backgrounds have access to affordable quality and mental health care. Ladies and gentlemen, before I turn it over to the experts here and to Brittany, think about the kind of questions that you want to have answers to, or think about the kinds of issues that you think we need to be addressing, because we do want you to participate. We've taken the opportunity to grab as much of a diversity of people working in this space, from hospital protocols to MDs delivering and policymakers and activists, so that we hear from all fronts on this issue, because this is a very serious issue. So without further ado, it's all yours, Tim.
So just really quick before we get started, I definitely wanted to thank the Congresswoman and her team, Taskforce. As a first responder, it's important to know that there are people working on the back end, helping us to change things so we can do better at the front end as first responders. And even, thanking Pastor DeForest for at least allowing us to have this in this space. This is breaking stigma. This is part of the solution, is actually having this discussion in this space. So I thank you for that. So before we kind of dive deep into the mental health issues surrounding
I'm sorry, I was raised better than this. Reverend Dr. Taskforce, I call him Buster because he's also part of my family. And whenever, ever I've ever needed him, he has always been available to me personally, professionally, and he's always opened up the church. We're grateful to be here. I thank you for making this happen for us. Thank you. I'm sorry.
So before we dive deep into some of the issues, the mental health issues affecting Black youth in that space, I'd like you guys to share your interaction with that space and also how you interact in that space with your profession. So we'll start from here and we'll go down.
Well, good evening, everyone. These statistics that you have heard about the alarming and troubling increase in suicide rates among youth is something which rests firmly within the jurisdiction of my committee and the General Assembly. And it has been important for me to help to alert my colleagues of the danger, to understand what's going on. It's not a time to be sort of depressed and crestfallen. It's a time to take action. And this is a space in which government needs to play a role to set the table for addressing these awful statistics, to try to understand them and to develop a policy that will help turn the tide so that we can save so many young lives. It's unclear, the research, what is causing these problems, but it seems to me that, and many of us who have a little bit of gray on their hair and perhaps not, understand that children are growing up in a time where the pressures upon them are unlike any person that many of us knew growing up. And we haven't, either within the family or within our school systems, been able to develop a resiliency among our youth to protect them from the pressures that they face today. The whole world's open to them. And that can be a force for good, but it also brings with it some terrible forces, which can lead children astray, make them feel inadequate, lead the way to bullying and other very negative behaviors which lead to tragic outcomes. We need to understand that and to address it. It starts, like everything else in medicine, we've tried to get a diagnosis, or we try to screen, get a diagnosis, and then do an intervention. And for many children, since they are in schools, I believe that school certainly is one of the places to start, to develop a resilience in our children so that they can better defend against all the pressures that they're facing today, pressures that were unknown to many of us growing up.
Hello, family. Now you know that we believe in call and response. Hello, family. All right, it's going to get better as we go on, I'm certain. Right, Reverend? Because I was here yesterday, and for Women's Day, everyone was much more actively engaged than that. So I am delighted to have an opportunity to sit upon this incredible stage, but also right at the request of this particular Congresswoman in this particular great state. The manner in which I interface with this area is that at RWJ Barnabas Health, I oversee all of our state and federal lobbying, and as a result of that, work very closely with our integrated behavioral health network. RWJ Barnabas Health has the largest integrated behavioral health network within the state of New Jersey. It also has the largest behavioral health hospital within that state. And so, in addition to every other thing that we oversee, that we offer in our services, that too is a category that I'm traditionally bothering this man and this woman about as we are lobbying either on the Hill or in the State House for advancements to ensure that we are properly treating, right, and really meeting the felt needs of our communities. But in addition to that, I also have the fortunate blessing, the calling to drive something called social impact and community investment across our system. And it is that work that is truly focused on the social determinants of health. So those things that affect your health outcomes outside of your clinical experience. Instead, where you live and whether or not it's a safe environment, whether or not you live in healthy housing, whether or not you have access to affordable, nutritious food, whether or not you actually are in a stable work environment. So why do I mention all of that? Well, I mention all of that because it enables us really, right? Because that work is led by a policy arm through an equity lens. It permits me an opportunity to speak directly to the systems and structures both externally in government, but also internally inside of our institution, which is pretty formidable when you have an affiliated 44,000 employee network, right? When you have some 9,000 doctors, it provides me an opportunity to literally engage in conversations around health equity and whether or not we are ensuring that the most vulnerable have access to the health care that they truly need and deserve. And that, of course, includes their behavioral health network access as well. What barriers have we erected internally that we need to dismantle in order to ensure that everyone has an opportunity to grow up healthy and well? And so that's my experience in this space.
Hello, everyone. As I was sitting here, I was fighting so hard to not cry because my perspective is the consumer. So I am a suicide survivor. And to be on a panel with amazing and distinguished leaders who are doing this work. And so as a mental health advocate, I am a peer recovery specialist. And so I use my lived experience. I'm not a clinician, I don't diagnose anyone, but I'm always advocating for therapy. And so I use my personal experience to assist individuals who are in recovery with their goals. I also serve I am from New Jersey, but after going to Howard and Georgetown, I've been going for about 10 years now. And so I serve on the Maryland Behavioral Health Council to be able to help, advocate for policies that impact people who live with mental illness. In addition to that, I also lost my 14-year-old cousin who would have turned 19 this year. He also died by suicide. So suicide prevention for me is something that's very important to me. It has led me to start my podcast, and I have been speaking. And I also recently released a book called Saved and Depressed, A Suicide Survivor's Journey of Mental Health, Healing, and Faith. Because it's really important that as an African American and as a person who identifies as a Christian, that the mental health stigma in the Black church is removed so that people can know that it's okay to go to therapy and it does not mean that you lack faith in God. And so that's really what the work that I have been doing through hosting events. I recently hosted an event called Saved Our Babies, where I had a panelist of mental health professionals, individuals who live with mental illness, and a mom who lost her son to suicide, where we talked about this very important topic, how do we identify the signs of depression and suicide among our children, and what are the things that parents can do? And so, as a consumer, September makes 4 years that I've been with the same awesome therapist. And it is my mission and my prayer that mental health becomes normalized, that just like we talk about going, if we have a problem with our heart, we would go to the cardiologist. And I remember being in the hospital, I thought I was too educated because I had a degree from Howard and a master's from Georgetown. And I remember telling the lady when I was, after my suicide attempt in the hospital, I don't belong here. And she said, what do you mean? I said, I have 2 degrees. And she said, well, you're here because your brain is sick. And so if you don't take care of your brain, it gets sick. And for some reason, it's stuck with me because I started to realize that mental illness and a crisis look different. It's not always the person walking down the street who is talking to themselves. Sometimes it's people who are very functional, who are struggling. And so that's a bit of the things that I do because of my personal experience of living with mental illness.
So first off, I want to thank you for sharing that. I think that's actually really important, and it's really important that we articulate that and people hear that and we normalize that. So thank you so much for sharing that part of your story. Hello, Franklin. It's your councilwoman. So how I got involved in mental health. So before I moved into politics, I went to school for forensic psychology and forensic mental health counseling. So my past career life, I spent a lot of time in the Philadelphia prison system and Norristown State Hospital. I'm sorry, my boss is being a stage mom and taking a picture of me, so Assemblyman Andrew Zwicker is here. Sorry. So that's how I started my career. I started my career when there was a failure of the system. So all of my patients, all of my consumers were incarcerated or serving time, or they were placed in a psychiatric hospital and determined treatment remittent, which meant that there was no known ways to treat their mental illness. So that's the world that I've worked in, and I have seen it, disproportionately impact, men and women of color that have started to commit crimes or got arrested for substance abuse issues because they're trying to manage their mental illness. And I had seen time and time again the criminalization of mental illness. And it got really frustrating, right? So I did what I could while I can. I worked with the Philadelphia Police Department and helped do their mental health training. So I would go there for, there would be cohorts, and, I would be role-playing what to do when you encounter someone, who may have a hoodie on, they're talking to themselves. Like, using my knowledge to role-play someone who may be suffering for an acute crisis in order to better train officers how to interact with them. I came back to New Jersey and I did some work in Trenton, and I did some work in a facility that I will not name. I really got sick of being on the, I don't want to say failing side, but the side where something had already gone so catastrophically wrong. I wanted to be on the other side. I wanted to be able to be in the room with the people that make these decisions because they don't know. They've never spoken to someone who is suffering from a mental illness or suffering from an acute symptoms of their mental illness. They have never sat face to face with the consumer and listened to them. They've never done that. So at one point, I was just like, I have to be in the room. So I found the first assembly person that I could find. And I made the case that it's really important for people with this type of background be in the room, as Assemblyman Conaway alluded to, helping to make these decisions and steering this narrative, because I want to be able to put my colleagues in my past life out of business because we're doing it the right way. We are addressing mental health in the right way. So people are getting help when they need it before it becomes a crisis, before it becomes a problem. So I am not an assembly person, I just work for one, but I do steer him in that direction. But on the lower level, as a local elected official, it's my job to think about ways that I can dismantle the systemic ways that have kept people from accessing mental health care, specifically for the African American community, how I can dismantle the systemic racism and the socioeconomic boundaries, and figuring out how on the local level I can be that bridge. So that's how I got here. Thank you.
Good evening. Councilwoman, Pastor, thank you so much. I'm so honored to have this opportunity to be here. I want to tell you a little bit about the Urban Mental Health Alliance, but before I do that, I want to share a little bit about my story. Everything that my esteemed panelists have talked about resonated so much with me. So I am just coming up on 17 years of recovery from alcoholism and addiction. Thank you. That was all God. And I am also a survivor of suicide, meaning that I actually lost my mother to suicide. And I was young at the time. I was 12. By the time I was 14, I was a full-fledged functioning alcoholic. And I stayed in active alcoholism for more than 20 years. It wasn't until I came into recovery that I realized that I had been living the majority of my life with social anxiety disorder, depression, and post-traumatic stress disorder. And obviously, the suicide of my mother was a big T trauma. And so that is what put me into addiction, because essentially for the next 20 years I was self-medicating. It wasn't until I saw the look on my daughter's face that I remembered seeing on my mother's face that I realized that something was broken. So I started doing my homework, because when I went into rehab, I was told that you can't drink anymore and don't be around anybody who drinks. Well, drinking was the only self-coping skill that I knew. And so I knew I had to do some homework. If you're telling me I can't drink, then I have to learn some self-coping skills. So I started volunteering anywhere where anybody would have me, the National Alliance on Mental Illness, Children's Futures, the Center for Family Community Social Justice, Greater Trenton Behavioral Health Care, just so I could learn. I sat on boards, I sat on committees, I chaired forums, I did panels, I got certified to teach mental health and wellness. But what I realized was that nobody in Black America was talking about it. And it occurred to me that if we had been talking about it in 1978, my mother might still be alive. So I thought, well, I'm going to go online and I'm going to find out who is talking about mental health in Black America. And I found nothing. And God directed me to Trenton. And since I was living in Trenton, then I said, this is where we're going to start. So I gathered some colleagues together, one of which is my esteemed colleague in the back, my founding vice president of the board. I pulled about 5 people together and I said, let's start a grassroots organization where we make it a safe place in Black America to start talking about mental health. Because we know that our Black and brown communities are marginalized. We know that our Black and brown communities are impoverished. We know that our Black and brown communities are traumatized, and we don't provide safe spaces to talk about mental health. In fact, we humiliate and judge when we talk about mental health. I have family members now, 40 years later, that still won't mention my mother's name. We needed to have an opportunity to have this conversation. So we came together and we built the Urban Mental Health Alliance, just celebrating our 5th anniversary this November. And our mission is to be able to empower individuals and families in Black and brown communities, in urban communities, with mental health and wellness information, with mental illness and recovery information, with addiction and recovery information. We create safe spaces to be able to have this conversation so that vicious cycle doesn't continue. What I have found is that our youth continue to struggle. We have youth that are living in homelessness, that are in domestic violence situations, that are raising their younger siblings, that are going in and out of the justice system because they're broken, because they're wounded, because they're in a state of trauma. And as my esteemed panelist said, instead of recognizing mental health in our Black and brown communities as a mental illness, we criminalize it. So then we continue to tear our families and communities apart further. I believe passionately that when we teach our individuals and families what mental health looks like, what mental illness looks like, and what self-advocacy looks like, then we can recognize when our individuals and families and communities are suffering, and that we know how to be the ones to reach out and find the tools and resources that we need. I believe that this change has to come from the bottom up. You change a community by changing individuals. Thank you.
Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. Let's just give it up one more time for this panel. Amazing. Thank you guys for doing the work that you So I want to hop into risk factors. So one of the things that I heard were cycles and patterns. And so I believe that's the root of risk factors when we're talking about Black youth. And so let's talk about what are some of those risk factors of suicide, and how are they different from maybe white youth? Because I think it's important to distinguish the two, right? When we're talking about community, when we're talking about neighborhoods, when we're talking about different things that plague, the African American community.
I was going to say, I can start off, but Ms. Zimmerman Conway can shut it
Yes,
down.
sir. Good job.
I think top level, it's understanding the trauma that we're born with and that we carry with us. The trauma that we don't know that we have until we have that talk about what to do if you're in a store, what to do if you're going to get pulled over, and you realize that you're different, right? And you're different, and then there's an oppressive layer on that, and you're hyper vigilant because you have to watch what you say, watch what you do, how you sit. Your hair can only be a certain way. I clearly have ignored that in my later years, but and you carry that. You carry that weight. And to someone who is, someone who has the mechanisms, that's even hard. So you put the human factor, and humans can have mental illness. That's an added layer of stress, and it's stress that is different for persons of color than it is for individuals who are white, because we are living with the fact that we are Black, and we have been made to feel that it is a burden, despite the fact that it is not a burden, it is beautiful, and we carry that. And we sometimes don't even know what that is. We don't know how to articulate what that is, and we just sit with it, and it eats at us. So it's hard. It's hard because you can't articulate it to your community, because depending on, where they sit, you are judged. You're not doing something well enough. It means you're not good enough. You're not praying hard enough. And you don't know what to do. And you just carry that weight, and it weighs. And it shouldn't. And that's, where I sit as an elected official when I say dismantling systems of oppression. Because if we can start dismantling that, we can let ourselves breathe. We can let our children start to breathe.
And that's where this question of social determinants of health come in. If you look at the measures that impact health outcomes for individuals, Black people, African Americans, are the wrong end of that spectrum. So if you talk about poverty, it's very hard. It's very hard to live a life without the resources you need to feed yourself and your family, to be well housed, to be well educated. When you talk about paralysis and racism, all those are the wellspring, the thing which forms all of these terrible statistics start with that, with this terrible racial legacy we have in this country that leads to chronic underinvestment in the community, the lack of being able to build up community resources and wealth and pass it on to children, educational systems which don't have the funding they need to provide an adequate, more than adequate education. So when you talk about counseling in schools, mental health services in schools, healthcare in general, we know that if a child doesn't have good healthcare, that child doesn't learn as well. We understand, I believe we're going to come to understand how important it is to have mental health counseling in schools. Well, that's got to be funded. And if your schools are underfunded for a thorough and efficient education, doesn't take that into account. Just imagine when we raise the alarm, as we will, about the need for mental health services in the schools. So, poverty, the lack of education, the legacy of racism, the lack of insurance access, an enormous social determinant of health. And you look at the statistics, Black people tend to be uninsured, or they are either uninsured or underinsured, and unable to get the health care that they need. Our society, and this is compounded by the fact that our society is not paying for these mental health services. I mean, I don't care who you are, your access to mental health services are inadequate. And you look at a person of color, they are even less adequate. And you wonder, and you talk about resiliency and trying to get through a problem. That's an issue. Now, lastly, I'll end with this. When you grow up having to understand and bearing up against this historic racism, what are you taught to do? You are taught to bear up. You You are taught to bury your feelings, hold them inside, and walk through the fire. Every day and every day, walk through the fire, hold your head up, and don't let them see you cry, don't let them see you pray. And you learn that, and particularly as I'm sure for everybody, for a male, and all that machoism and all that other thing that goes on, you now compound that even further. So that maybe when looking at suicide youth among black men, young African American men, that is a legacy of racism that has informed the way young boys are raised and their responsibilities and to themselves and society. And I tell you, it's a process that feeds. It's a sort of a negative feedback loop that saps one's strength and leaves one vulnerable to some of these more drastic measures that people take to end the pain.
Oh, okay. I was going to speak to generational trauma, and some of the panelists alluded to it, and talking about when you think about how we originally got here, taken away from our land, and then from there, going from, slavery to Jim Crow, when you think about that, we didn't really have a space to heal. We had essentially what would have been considered therapy for us would be church. So we never knew that we didn't have the proper coping skills, how to deal with that. And so not only is that trauma unresolved and it's passed down from generation to generation, now we also don't even have the coping skills to be able to deal with the trauma. As a person who has watched my mom be verbally and physically abused, and learning about my family history, who my great-grandmother, who is still alive today, she was also abused. And so when I'm hearing these stories and no one is actually talking about it, and then you see people in your family who are struggling with substance use or alcoholism, and it's because we only know how to cope through that way because of what we saw, those learned behaviors, which are unhealthy coping skills. And then when you think about the suicide rate among black children, they do not only know how to deal with the life stressors and things that they're going through, but the adults don't know how to deal with it either. And so if children are watching how their parents or their guardians are responding, or sometimes parents will, I can't speak for other races, but I know a lot of times in the black community, when a child comes to you and say like they're upset or they're sad or they're stressed out, ain't nothing wrong with you. Like, talk to me when you got bills. It's like, right, and then that makes a child's like shut down because now you're not even validating my feelings. You're not even validating how I'm feeling. And so now I'm learning how to deal with it on my own. And 9 times out of 10, we may suppress. As a person who has started struggling with suicidal thoughts at 12 years old and attempted at 14 and again at 25, I know I look 12, but and so as a person who's watched my father be incarcerated in and out of jail, and seeing crack bottles on the floor growing up, those things play a huge role in a child's development. And it was not until I was forced to get to mental health treatment that I now know how I have worked through the trauma. I now am the healthiest version of myself. But if you don't have that, if they're not talking about, for instance, like in school, teachers or administrators, when you think about mental health first aid, so that's a training that I've gone through, and I'm also currently going through the training to teach mental health first aid. But there are administrators and teachers who don't even know how to respond to children who are struggling emotionally and mentally. And so I believe that by having something as basic as, just like we have CPR when someone is going, is struggling that way, or, having a heart attack or going into like cardiac arrest. With mental health first aid, now people can identify the signs of what a crisis looks like because it looks differently. Especially, I know that therapists can vouch that a lot of times for children with depression, it shows up in like irritation or like agitation. And so you think like, oh, they're just being moody. Maybe your child is going through a depression. And so I don't think sometimes we actually pay attention to that.
Yeah. And sometimes kids that don't have the language to express that, right? And so they do act out a lot, when it comes to behaviors or even in their play, they're acting things out. And so I know that there were a couple things that, people mentioned in regards to kind of the generational trauma. And I think, Takia, you're right on target when you're saying that a lot of our environments can be invalidating, because the priority is we have to make money, we have to hustle, we have to keep moving. We don't have time to stop to look at your feelings and to find out what's going on with you and to heal you, right? And I think historically, African Americans have been called resilient people, and yet at the same time, we wear that as a badge of honor, right? And yet at the same time, there's also a lot of hurt and pain that's underneath that is very unresolved. So I'm, glad that you guys did absolutely mention that generational trauma piece.
I wanted to just touch on that generational trauma piece a little bit more, because everything you said is just so valid. We not only have the trauma that comes down to the womb, right, but then we bring our children into trauma. And mass incarceration and drug infiltration had a lot to do with that trauma. It completely destroyed not only our homes, but our communities. So we have children now that are being born into this trauma. We don't have that cohesive family or that support to be able to raise this child in a healthy environment, right? And then what happens is we do wear a badge of honor when it comes to being strong and being resilient, but what that has really done for us as a people is it has given the world permission to oppress us and tell us to deny our healing and our self-care, right? Because if we don't, then we're considered weak. So we have our youth that are realizing that they're struggling, but they're also being told that they can't have a voice, because if they have a voice, then they're going to be weak and vulnerable, right? And so they're lost in the middle there. If no one who looks like me is going to talk to me about what I'm going through, then I'm going to go on social media and I'm going to find a way out the way I see other people finding a way out that don't look like me, because maybe that seems to work for them, right? Because we're not validating our youth, we're not hearing their voice, we're not bringing them to the table, and our youth are walking around with pain and brokenness and trauma that our parents and grandparents never experienced, because our worlds and our communities are so broken today from a lot of the infrastructure that has been put in place purposely to break our communities down. So we need to realize that when that happens, it affects our adults, but it affects our youth even worse, because they're looking for someone to be their support, and our adults don't know how to be that support. I want to also resonate around mental health first aid. I'm also a mental health first aid facilitator. It is indeed a phenomenal program, and there's a youth mental health first aid training as well. And that's not for youth, but it's for adults who engage with youth. And I actually had somebody ask me a question. They said, yeah, I heard about mental health first aid and youth mental health first aid, but does that work for Black folks? Yes, it does. Because what it means is you need to stand up in front of the room, and you need Black folks to see Black folks teaching this, and you need Black folks to bring Black culture to this training. So when I teach mental health first aid and youth mental health first aid in and around Trenton, I teach it in terms of what the urban community looks like, because the stress in the urban community is very different from the stress in the suburban community, is very different from the stress in our rural communities. So we need people who look like us to be vulnerable enough and courageous enough to stand up and say, I'm going to talk about this, and I'm going to empower you to be able to talk about it.
So I always like to say yes and, right? So yes to all of my panelists, right? My fellow panelists. And we've heard some about the oppression that has happened historically to us and in our communities. But I really think it's incredibly important to do two things. One, right, to call the thing a thing, right? And so when we talk about that, we're literally talking about the fact that we have to be about the business of addressing systemic and structural racism, right? Because we talk about things like, right, an absence of a father, or the violence in our communities, the poverty that is concentrated. But that poverty is concentrated because it was intended to be concentrated in communities full of Black and brown people. That the lines on those maps were really red, y'all. That's why they call it red line, right? That we understand what this looks like. We understand that when everything from the GI Bill to land grants were giving out, that we were literally empirically excluded in order to get passage of the congressional resolutions. I want to make certain that we do not leave that on the vine, because it is such an incredible aspect to what it is that we're looking at today, right? When we talk about, what are the additional stressors? When we spoke about social determinants of health, right? We talked about, it's whether or not you have access to healthy, nutritious food, and whether or not you live in a safe environment. Well, all of that is impacted undoubtedly by the systems and structures that have been literally didactically formed in order to ensure the proliferation of the permanence of an underclass. This did not just happen. And the reason why I say that, I think it's so important, is because when you talk about the resilience that we have in our community, and indeed, ladies and gentlemen, brothers and sisters, congratulations. The fact that you are alive today after everything that you have gone through, from the Middle Passage to Jim Crow, absolutely, to Donald Trump. I couldn't help myself, Congresswoman. I'm so sorry. But the truth of the matter is, right, it is not paranoia when they are really out to get you. And so this system, these structures, have truly been out to get you. My God, when I take a look at what our stats are right now, I brought my phone up on stage with me, and both my cousin and my chief of staff were like, what are you doing? Why are you taking that up on stage? But it was because of the fact that they were texting me what our ER and admission stats were for today, my daily census on today. I had asked them, where are we in our behavioral health network as it breaks down along the demographic of Black youth, right? What are we seeing today? And what we have seen is the fact that while African-American male youth tend to be more successful, African-American female youth have more attempts, right? And that already, so in 2018, for the year, we had 525 suicide attempts from that demographic, right? Already, with 5 months left to go in this year, we have 300, right? So I think that's also really keenly important that we make ourselves aware of the fact that, yes, there is a cultural aspect to this, right? Children are to be seen and not heard, right? And so we've grown up with that over time. Certainly, we have all had adverse childhood experiences, right? So we've all had something that has happened in our lifespan, in our history. Indeed, that is why you're resilient, because you chose on that day to push forward to the next day, right? So we're here on purpose. But I think it's also really keenly important that we do not leave on the shelf the fact that systemically, right, the stacks have really been placed against us. And that now, it is not just that folks have to deal with things now that historically we have not. Listen, if my beloved late father were here, he would tell you that he walked 12 miles to school one way and then 24 miles back, right? He has gone home to glory. So I certainly understand that the generations before us had their adversities, because he also talks about how he worked for a week for 5 cents. But I think that what is unique here is also the contribution of social media and living in a global village. Like, while it may seem like it's a really wonderful thing, and in fact it is, right? The fact that you can flip open your phone or go to your laptop or open your iPad and see your brothers and sisters in Zimbabwe and Zaire, right? Everywhere else is fantastic. The problem with that is that I can also open it and see what's happening to an individual that looks just like me in Ferguson, Missouri, and Baltimore. And what I see is the fact, not just that individuals who look like me are then harmed either by others, right, who are supposed to serve and protect, and or others who, quite frankly, are members of our own community, but that I get to see it over and over and over again. And I get to see that there is no justice when it occurs. And so there is something that happens, there's an impact and effect on our self-esteem, our self-worth, and our value, right, that gets eaten away at. And so it's really important that we also talk about the PTSD that our children are having to deal with. We know that when grown men return from war, that they are suffering at epic proportions. So imagine the child who has had to step over the crack vials, right, in that community, witness the fact that an individual, because there was a shooting last night, and nevertheless I got up this morning, made myself breakfast, and walked to school. That the body that was there this morning is actually still there, but now they put a sheet over it, right? And expect them to perform on the world stage as if nothing else is different. That's what we're talking about the systemic and structural issues that are still impacting and affecting our communities. And the cure that we need is going to require all of us.
We talked about different systems, and we talked about the governmental systems, political systems. We talked about family systems, right? And so we talked about that generational trauma and how that's something that is passed down from generation to generation. And yet I also want to add another piece to that too when it comes to single parenthood. Because what happens is that when there are single parent homes, children are more susceptible to something called parentification. And parentification is basically a child taking on the role as an adult, as a spouse in the home to assist and to help out. And so it shows that the research shows that Black male youth that are coming from single parent homes are 6.4 times higher to die by suicide because of being in a single parent home. And so I think that's something definitely to look at, because parentification is a huge stressor for those that grow up in single parent homes as well.
And I think that's what you bring up speaks to me as someone who grew up in a single parent home.
Me too.
So, I mean, I think in retrospect I had a level of parentification, but to me it never seemed to be to a detriment, right? Like I never felt overly burdened until, you know, my mom, unfortunately, she would develop cancer and she would pass away. And at that point, I really felt like a parent because I had to step up because it was just me. So like, you know, and I could be anecdotally, but I always kind of push back on that because I think I don't know if my life would have been better had my dad been, I don't know my dad, but like I don't know if it'd been better. But I do understand that for some families, depending on other variables, that could be a major risk factor. And I think what the other end of that is the support system. So my mother was a single parent, but we had an amazing support system. Like my grandmother is back there. Like she was a support system. Like she was. So I think that like segues into the idea of the support system, because whatever risk factors we may have, if we have a good and strong support network, we can start balancing that. And you know, we still obviously need to reach out and get the appropriate care from a professional, but those can kind of assist.
I think that's absolutely right. Especially what you're talking about is definitely environmental and circumstantial. And so I know that there's a lot of people, especially when it comes to, well, for instance, I'll be transparent. I was born and raised on the south side of Chicago, and my mom was a single parent also. And so at the age of 13, I had to get out to work to contribute to the household. And so that caused a lot of resentment for me that I worked out through my own therapy, right? And so on top of being a student, right? On top of, you know, being a friend, on top of just the normal teenage girl stuff that I had on my plate, it was also, I was a contributor in my household as an adult. So for sure, there was an increase in responsibility when you know, are coming from a single parent home, but it is surely circumstantial.
And I think it's also what you kind of say, I didn't have to do that,
yeah.
but that meant my mother was doing more.
Right.
So I was unaware of the unseen work that she was doing, right? So there was a level of burden that I was made to be unaware of so I could continue on. And I think that speaks to kind of the generational stuff that, you know, we spoke of earlier, where, you know, I was released from it, but my mother took it on. And that may have added and contributed to her, you know, feelings and how she had to handle stress and stuff and so forth.
And it goes back even to family systems too, because my mom was raised in Alexandria, Louisiana, a very small town, like 3 hours outside of New Orleans. And so her mother would take her. My mom started working at 10 years old, cleaning up white people's homes and, you know, making food and making dinner. And my mom was into it also. And so it's just the family, you know, that generational piece that kind of just passes down on like who has what role and what's okay to take on this role when we need to redefine roles to make things more healthy, especially to have that healthier dyad between the parent and the child. Absolutely.
I want to go back and talk about our boys, and I specifically say boys because we adultify our young Black boys way too early.
Yeah.
So I think one of the things that's really important is that when we look at mass incarceration, or we look at drug infiltration, and we look at addiction, and we look at mental illness, and we look at death from early disease. Our men are ripped away from our homes, and our young boys don't have that male influence. And I'm speaking from the experience of growing up in a single-family home, as well as being a single-family parent. And when I got divorced, my children's father suddenly became very absent. And I'm looking at this young boy trying to figure out how am I going to teach him to be a man, and what man do I trust in my life that's going to be able to be a role model for him. And so I think that affects our boys deeply, right? Because there's nobody to identify with who's going to teach you how to not only be a man, but how to be a black man. And so I think that has a real detrimental effect on our communities, and it's to no fault of our own. I mean, I realize that a lot of fathers aren't stepping up to the plate. I realize that a lot of fathers are going to prison. A lot of fathers fall into addiction. But there's structure around that. There's reasons why that has happened. It's called strategic oppression, and it was designed purposely to rip black families apart. There's policies that were put in place to make sure that black women didn't have black men in the home, and that has deeply affected our black boys. And so we need to really speak to the elephant in the room about the fact that our young black boys and our young black men don't have those role models. That's not to say that we don't have awesome grassroots organizations that are stepping up to the plate to make sure that there's role models for our boys, but it doesn't replace having a black father in the black home to model and encourage and empower that young black man. So we want to make sure that we don't overlook that fact. I appreciate the fact that our young black girls have their mothers, even when our mothers are not totally healed, even when our mothers still have a lot of work. A black woman to look up to emulate, to be able to have engagement with. Our boys don't have that, and our boys are suffering for it.
Well, on that, we understand that what do we do or try to do in our households? We understand that children, as they mature, as they age, that there's a sort of a system of graded responsibility that's age appropriate. When you now take a child and put them in a situation where they have to engage in age-appropriate behaviors, one of the things that happens, of course, is their development is arrested. The stages and the achievements they need to make at age 8 or 9 or 10 are left behind because now they have to achieve at the level of a 17, 18, or 20-year-old. And there's pathology in there. And you mentioned, and I think that you brought it up, it's so important to understand the attack on the structure of the family that started in slavery days. Families separated willy-nilly, this idea of marriage staying together totally disregarded, the way that the welfare system worked to deliver resources to families that were in need, the prison industrial complex you mentioned, the terrible policies around mass incarceration and the other things that had been done, all contribute to this, even this kind of joblessness, not being able to perform the role that an adult, particularly adult male, needs to perform in society because of the racism around access to education, access to jobs. So all of that has had this terrible impact of ripping families apart and forcing children to take on responsibilities that they're not ready to handle. And that kind of stress then can be turned inward, and we get these negative outcomes. Now, you can build systems around to gird the child, to protect the child against these things. Thank goodness for the grandparent in the house. Of my own mother, my grandparents, took on three siblings that because they were part of the family. The parents died in a terrible accident, but you had a family down south where you could pull people together, and they didn't have much, but you had what, and we could, 3 children parceled here, 2 went to another relative, and you could keep some sense of family together within a family structure that was supported in the community by the family. These kinds of connections have been under attack. They're not as strong as we might wish them to be, but we, in thinking about structure, can build the kinds of structures and support, recognizing what's happening to children that are growing up in families that have been, for any number of reasons, torn apart.
So, Herb, let me say this in response. My comes with me. Let me say this, because if we only focus on the historical, analytical, theoretical you just described, So I would hope that all of you, because all of you have examples of things you've done, so don't be humble, in things you've seen that work. In this church, we decided 21 years ago to recreate that atmosphere. We recruited and trained 465 families to get licenses to be foster parents. And if you come to our church on a Sunday morning, you can't tell the difference between the biological children and the foster. We've placed 1,440 foster children in our foster homes in New Jersey. And we've adopted 300. So when we talk about suicide and mental health, a child who comes out of foster care is 4 times more likely to have mental problems than a child who was not in. The foster care system is as criminal as the prison industrial complex. So what? I mean, I'm not on the panel. But all of you have similar examples. Your work has done interventions. Micheline, you've got some real stuff that the system's doing. So talk about concrete solutions, because if all we leave here with is our enhanced understanding of slavery, then we'll leave here just mad. And we won't have solutions. We need solutions.
I'd really like to do a bit of a deep dive into what you were talking about. This first aid kit, this mental health first aid kit. That's the first I've ever heard of that.
It's a great system.
I'd like to know what that is.
I was actually a trainer. So in Philadelphia, I was trained and did trainings. And it has expanded since. And I will pivot to you since you were actively talking about it as well. But it is something to consider. It's something, it's easily accessible. They will come do the training. They will train the trainers so you can go off in your communities. And for me, when I did it, it was really eye-opening in terms of normalizing mental health care and your mental illness, because they really sit down and they talk to you about what we refer to as medical illnesses, and then they compare it to a mental health issue or a mental illness, and the statistics are staggering, right? It's like a silent killer that no one's really acknowledging. So that is one concrete thing, is connecting with, getting your organization or the church or even through the municipal government and doing a mental health first aid training and offering that is a concrete way to do something.
Yeah, I just want to talk. I want to go a little.
How long did it take you through the training? I'm sorry.
Yeah.
How long was the training? I just had staff look at that today.
If I remember, it was over 2 days, 2 or 3 days. It was like a full day to train the trainer.
What about the training itself for the individual?
That's 8 hours, because I did that training. So like the training to just be certified in a mental first aid responder, it's teaching you how to identify the signs when someone is in a crisis. The things to say to someone when they're in a crisis, the things not to say when someone is in a crisis. And that's the training I took, and I believe it was 8 or 9 hours. And at the end of the training, you have to take a test to make sure that you comprehend, what was learned. And I found it to be beneficial because, for me, I'm working with individuals with severe mental illness or individuals with substance use disorders. And so when I'm working with someone, and for instance, I've even, was telling family members, if someone is saying things like, for instance, they are thinking about ending their lives, or they're having thoughts about death, not to brush it off and say just pray about it, you'll be fine. And so really talking to someone and saying, okay, when someone is in a crisis, what are the things that I need to say, and how can I help them until someone can get here who is actually a professional?
So this possibility of training people to be able to respond is something that I'm really glad we're talking about this in the church, because one of the things that we've been considering as a task force, where do our first responders lie? Yeah. Here's one place. But if you're in a school and you have a teacher and you're acting out because you're in crisis, what do we need to do to make sure that teachers are competent enough to distinguish the acting out as a symptom of some pain, as opposed to just put that kid in an alternative school or shoot that kid over to juvenile justice, or, you know.
My staff and interns today participated with mental health and teachers, or teachers working in the mental health space, to understand the kinds of systems that might be placed in schools. California has some interesting legislation. We actually have one of our colleagues, Carol Murphy, has a bill that would provide or mandate a mental health first aid training that's been introduced into the legislature. I asked today, how much would it cost? How much time do we mandate? Can we consider mandate that across the school systems in some way? At least, these are things, interventions that we need to think about at the policy level. And this group felt that the mental health first aid training was one of the important interventions that comparatively are relatively low cost, that would allow, just like screening, early identification of people that are having a problem, and then of course we have to build the systems for referral of people who are identified as having an issue. It's one of the other things. We'll discuss that some more as we go on.
We are also actually funding an initiative that is being run by the Cody Mental Health Fund right now in the schools. What is interesting is the fact that our research has evidence that it's not necessarily just the teachers, that many times students, when they are having difficulty, they are more likely to talk to the security guard, right, the TA, right, the teacher's aide, the woman in the lunchroom. So really, it's also training those individuals in order to make sure that they understand that because these children are naturally coming to you, because there's an element of trust there, they're not necessarily the authority figure in that environment, really that they are resources that they can utilize, that there are techniques that they can utilize, a toolkit that they can utilize in order to connect those children to the help that they need.
And I want to can I just go into the detail about mental health first aid? Because there's two of them that I think are really important. It's the adult mental health first aid and the youth mental health first aid, which I alluded to earlier. And youth mental health first aid is for any adult that engages with our youth. So if we're talking about educators, administrators, we're talking about parents, we're talking about caregivers, we're talking about coaches, youth ministers, right? Anybody who engages with a youth, because as a Congresswoman alluded to, and I think a few of my panelists alluded to, is that mental health crisis looks very different in youth, and it's hard to determine, is this typical youth behavior or is this a crisis, right? So mental health first aid, what it actually does, if you think in terms of physical first aid, right, the American Heart Association, how it teaches you to recognize potential heart attack or stroke or high blood pressure or a burn victim or a choking victim, mental health first aid does the exact same thing. It teaches you how to recognize our very common mental illnesses. So what does depression look like? What does anxiety disorder look like? What does bipolar disorder look like? What does schizophrenia look like? What does psychosis look like, right? So if we see somebody stand on the street corner talking to a person that is not there, normally we're going to turn and go the other way because we have no idea how to engage with that. But mental health first aid actually teaches you how to recognize that. And then with youth mental health first aid, it goes a little deeper because it also goes into substance use disorders in our youth as well as eating disorders in our youth. And so I personally believe that all of our educators and all of our administrators need to have both adult mental health first aid as well as youth mental health first aid, because you're absolutely right. If a child is acting out in class, is that child acting out because they're being a typical teenager, or is that child acting out because there's trauma going on at home, right? And are we going to further traumatize that child by disciplining them instead of finding out what's causing this trauma in the child? So I think that mental health first aid and youth mental health first aid is crucial. It is relatively inexpensive. I personally, through my nonprofit, write grants to be able to bring it to Trenton because usually people can't afford this training. Okay, so I usually write grants and run public education sessions so that the community can come in and take this class. Because if I'm a grandmother raising 3 kids, one of those children is probably going to have some sort of crisis, and I need to know how to recognize that. So in addition to our educators, our families, our individuals need this training. The same way you get first aid, you need to get mental health first aid as well, because your brain is an organ just like your heart is an organ. If your heart can malfunction, your brain can malfunction, and we're not more knowing this stuff. So I can't support that enough.
Each county has a medical reserve corps, and volunteers of physicians, nurses, and lay people. I'm pretty sure our department has done some training in this area. but every county has that. And it could be a resource for, developing trainers and using volunteers as well as organizations to drive this kind of training across our society. I mean, whether it's in schools, outside of schools, in communities, it is something that was developed as a response to hurricanes and other traumas, earthquakes. But we are coming to understand that the schools are desperate need of this as well. So one potential resource, and you're right, it's not as expensive as I think we were looking at some training costs today because we're thinking, well, how do I get, how do I pay for it? I mean, any policy thing that I think of as a legislator is how are we going to pay for it? How are we going to put it into the budget? I mean, it's irresponsible not to do that. And so, I always ask the question, how many teachers do we have? How much the training's going to cost? Are there ways to do this without necessarily taxing the general fund, or getting volunteers and community service organizations, nonprofits to help us get this training in the hands of the people who can use it for everybody.
I think the trainings are crucial. I also think that schools partnering with outpatient facilities is a must because the school therapists that are set up in the school systems mostly work with the children on academics as opposed to, mental health issues. Of course, they're addressing those things, but can't fully address that, right? And typically refer to an outpatient provider. The problem is sometimes the parents don't follow up with the outpatient provider, and so there's a gap in treatment at this point. So if we are able to partner with people in the community that are clinicians to set up shop literally right in the school. I know of programs that are successful in Delaware and Maryland that have done this. If we can do that in the school systems, I think that will be a solution also in the school setting.
Now, China actually has this in their school system. I met with the Chinese delegation as we was discussing and thinking about this problem for the state, and there are governments who are actually doing that. Now, China is top down and they push, but they're recognizing this and providing that for their children. There are proposals. California has a proposal. We need to figure out how to do that. There are national bodies that would say that you should have a psychiatrist available for every 1 in 250 children, counselor available for 1 in every 250 children. We are at 1 for 700 plus children. Now we've got to decide to do this, and we've got to figure out how to fund it. Now, I was fortunate enough to be involved in the school funding formula that we have today. I was part of a task force to bring that school funding formula into being and drive that across our school system, past the Supreme Court challenge. And I wonder whether or not, as we think about this problem, that we need to do something similar to that and begin to make it a part of our funding formula, because it's got to be there from the beginning. It's got to be right there, built in to the curriculum of the school, and it's got to, and a commitment to it as part of a thorough and efficient education has got to be made. And so we may have to go back to that process that developed this funding formula, but we've got to figure out how to provide these resources in the school, get bring in the professionals, get the teachers trained, and we can't do that on the cheap. That's not going to happen. We can't wish it into being. We've got to take affirmative decisions and put it through the budgetary process, explain it to the people why we're doing it, and get support for the funding we need to get this treatment for our children.
And I think that is really important, but because I'm a mental health provider journeyman, it seems I was doing in-home crisis therapy for children for a period of time. And I have to say, when we do talk about children, I think sometimes, not necessarily on this panel, but we do have a habit of talking about children kind of in a silo and not recognizing the family system. Because there have been many times I've walked into a household to provide this crisis therapy and have walked into just oh, okay, all right, I get it, I understand. And trying to, in that moment, address their needs while dealing in a system that, due to many of the things that we talked about earlier, is also doing them harm. So it's so multi-layered that it's the family, it's society, it's being able to have a decent working wage so you can be there, so you can be present. It's so many things, and I think that's also part of the conversation, and we need to be making sure that we're talking about each of those silos and then busting them and then making one big that.
Yeah.
Riddle.
And not that this is a shameless plug whatsoever. My counseling agency, we're actually in the process of adding on, and so not just outpatient services, but adding on in-home Department of Children and Family, who has another layer of something called the Children's System of Care. And so we partner with them so that when we see that our children that are in the outpatient setting need a higher level of care, we're able to give them to the IIC, which is the Intensive and Community Therapist, to work with them. And so then when they're done with that, then they're able to step down. And so the state tell you that you have to do 2 hours in the home. And so typically we'll separate it into 1 hour with the child, 1 hour with the family, because it's about the child and the family dynamic. And so that's something that's a solution that I believe every outpatient should really go through, is offering that in-home therapy.
Is that enough time? 2 hours?
2 hours, yeah. 2 hours a week.
A week.
2 hours a week. Yes.
It is an extensive 2 hours.
Yes, absolutely.
I also just want to mention, we also do have, it's interesting hearing this dialogue around wanting to make certain that there's a school connection. I could not agree more, and we actually do have a model that at our facility in Jersey City. So Jersey City Medical Center has something called the Tiger's Den. And the Tiger's Den literally is a during the day school program for students who have been identified as struggling in a behavioral health manner. And so it is actually from first grade straight up through high school. It is not an after school program. Some of the students go to school for the first portion of the day and the rest of the day at the Tiger's Den. We have seen incredible success in reference to being able to equip them with the tools, right, and the language to articulate that I need a timeout, right? I need some time to myself, rather than simply having them, because we know that in African American youth, oftentimes depression and anxiety literally presents itself as rage or anger, right, rather than just being silent or sad. Although it can be both. And so as a result of that, we've actually been able to do that. To the good Assemblyman's point, however, it is grant funded, right? And so that grant is actually up at the end of this year, and so we're looking for opportunities to continue that pilot.
Always working this one.
And perhaps then, quite frankly, carry that model throughout our system to other communities in need as well.
I was going to add, so two things. One, when you think of in terms of a solution, so the National Alliance on Mental Illness, NAMI, they have free services. So they have support groups they have like a family support group. So for caregivers who are caring for children or loved ones who live with a mental illness. And those support groups are led by another family member who has been successful at working with individuals and loved ones. Another thing that comes up is in terms of when you think about, I think someone mentioned as far as, I think it was you, Brittany, as far as like counseling in the school systems, but when I spoke to a relative just the other day, she was saying like she doesn't think that the counseling is going deep enough. She feels like it's surface level for her child. And so I think in terms of actually, you know, when you think about funding, having funding so that these therapists can actually be able to talk about more things that are outside of academics.
Well, on that, there was some legislation that went forward. We're going to have to bring that again. It's going to be very important that what we fund as a government, and the system's chaotic. Just learning where all the various webs are and the avenues to get to care. You really do need someone to help you to navigate a system that is far too complicated and needs to be simplified. By the way, the 211 system for people out there, plug in for this. If you have a problem, you can call 211. You can go to 211. I think it's nj.org, is it? But there is a system to call to try to get yourself plugged into care. One of the questions that you raised is this question of how you get make decisions about funding, and it really needs to be based on evidence. We've got to make sure that if we're investing state dollars, that the program will deliver what it promises. And that means it needs to be thorough, it needs to be efficient in doing that, we need to monitor that, and we need to fund those kinds of programs, and perhaps not fund or defund programs that are not delivering on that promise. And that evaluation, the government needs to do more of that. We're not doing all of that now, but if we're going to make these commitment of dollars, and we need to do it, we had better make sure that we are spending money where it can do the most good and deliver what's promised.
Are you talking about evidence-based decision making?
There you go.
When it comes to
We need to transition
Yes,
at this moment. This has been an incredible conversation, has it not? And it is good to have, we have some money people here, the state people, you know? Here we go, we got Assemblyman Conaway, we got Assemblywoman Shavonda Sumter, we got Assemblyman Twicker, we got Assemblywoman Carter, and Assemblywoman Reynolds Jackson, my Assemblywoman. It's good that they hear. I said, yeah. But now we want to hear from you. I'm so glad that the pastor interrupted us and had us start talking about solutions, because it's absolutely right. We would have left here like. So I'm going to ask you this. I'm going to give a microphone to two of my staff members. One will be in this aisle and one will be in that aisle. I'm going to ask you to stand out in the aisle and ask your questions. And I'm going to also ask you, since we only have stand out in the aisle, and can I have another staff member? And ask your question. And the other thing I'm going to ask you is that you ask a question, and because we don't have a lot of time. Okay, thank you. You knew what that meant, right?
I knew what that meant.
Okie dokie. Let's start right over here.
I want to thank you, Congresswoman, for this wonderful panel. You continue serving us well, so thank you. And it was a wonderful panel. I enjoyed everything that you had to say.
Let me just say I'm grateful for that thankfulness. I got it.
Yes, ma'am. Receive. Regarding the educational piece, if I can be frank, the curriculum that our students receive in school is very disaffirming. Personal experience growing up, we learned more about white people conquering this country and others, and they had their heroes. In school, we don't hear about our heroes. Frankly, in school, my first educational lesson for black people was slavery, and then Crispus Attucks fighting for American freedom. So what changes are there going to be in the curriculum that serves our students so that education can just not be teaching, but can also be affirming for our young people?
Thank you for that question. We do have an Amistad Commission. That should be a part of our curriculum now. The issue is that we need to get it up, and it needs to be taught from elementary through high school. But the apparatus is there. We just got to make sure that we're putting the resources behind it.
Excuse me, I have a question to one of the panelists here. You mentioned about when someone's walking down the street talking to themselves, and then you mentioned about the kit, the training. My question is, does it teach you how to approach the person speaking to himself, or do you turn and walk away?
So that's actually an excellent question. And yes, mental health first aid actually delves down that deep. So it talks to you about how to engage with that person. Most people are fearful of psychosis because it's been portrayed in the media that people who are experiencing psychosis are violent. But the truth is, people who are experiencing psychosis are more than often going to be victims. So mental health first aid does actually tell you how to engage with this person, what to say, but also how to protect yourself if you do fear that they're going to be aggressive.
Okay. Another one was root causes and more than the family. I mean, my experience has been when you work with a child at school or work with a child at church, someone in the family should know what's going on so they can continue it. Instead of, because I've heard children say to me, you don't live in my house. So we need to figure out a way to not only work with the child, but the family needs to know so that they can participate in the healing as well.
Thank you, Reverend Coleman.
Yeah, and this needing to know is a very important thing, and it sort of harkens back to the first question about imaging. We heard in Washington about how negative images work through social media, are amplified through social media, and sort of drive this negativity right across the spectrum. And so we as parents, as a society, need to get, and we're seeing this in Congress, thank goodness, attention being paid to this. We need to do it at the state level as well, to the impact of social media on our children, and to empower parents to understand that medium and to control access to it, parent around it, understand that it's part of the landscape, and it's having negative consequences. It's having terrorists, it's bullying, it's sexting, it's a number of behaviors that couldn't occur when you had an analog telephone. But now negativity can take wing and negatively impact so many people and do it from many points. And so we've got to understand and get on top of it.
Thank you.
Good evening. My question is, after this meeting today, will the task force have an area where we can go and get this information and have a register for these classes, get access to these organizations? Another thing is how we, if we're a parent or even ourselves, I find it's very difficult. Is there an area we can find social workers, licensed psychologists of African American that specialize in family therapy, not just drug abuse, but family therapy? Where can we get this one access information?
So in regards to finding therapists or just in general finding people that are African American or just in general people of color, there's psychologytoday.com. There's also Therapy for Black Girls, where you can actually go on that website to find people of color to work with you and to work with children.
There's therapyforblackmen.org.
Yes.
And the shortages across the system, but particularly with people of color, and going through the training to be delivered the services to the community. So it's a workforce issue that I believe the task force is taking.
And I don't think you can, I think it's also really important to say that while there's a shortage, that please don't let that be a barrier to getting help, right? So every mental health provider should be engaging in cultural competency, and as a patient, as a consumer of their services, you're allowed to ask
That's the
them.
woman right there who made sure New Jersey.
Yeah, that you are allowed to ask these really difficult questions of, have you ever provided services for an African American? What's your competency level? And you can refuse them and move to someone else. That is your right as a patient. So it's also really important to know that.
And with regard to the task force is putting together the information and we're collecting, and we hope to come up with both a resource, best practices, solutions. Everything we find out is going to be made available to you. Next question.
Hi, good evening. My name is Dr. Liz Henry, and I am a pediatrician. And I wanted to ask particularly the Assemblyman and Micheline, as part of Robert Wood Johnson, as a person who's been on the forefront and on the front line for 17 years, over 17 years, there has been a scarcity of mental health providers. And I have parents coming to me asking, and they're not even in crisis. I may have someone who I just needs some therapy, needs to talk. And most of the good psychiatrists and psychologists don't take insurance. So you can have the best of the best insurance, and I spend 3 or 4 weeks waiting for someone to take the patient. And so it falls on the primary care provider to prescribe something in the meantime, to counsel them in the meantime, and during all of that, we only have the 15 minutes to do that, right? So my question is, and it's a real concern for the youth, is how and what are we doing to alleviate this scarcity and to prevent someone who really needs care or even just needs to talk to someone to not to wait 3 weeks, and so that the pediatrician or whoever the parent comes to, they can plug them in right there and then. And I don't know if you can, Micheline, enlighten us what you can do in a hospital setting, and then legislative-wise, what can we do legislatively for that?
Well, you raise a question that as internist I've seen the same issue on the adult side. If someone comes in and needs to have services, mental health services, I'm not a psychiatrist, but people need help of a counselor or psychiatrist. Getting that consult done and getting them in a timely way is a huge issue. And like anything else, you get what you pay for. If you don't pay for these services, don't be surprised. If you don't pay for a network, and the state doesn't demand that the network is adequate, then you have a problem with people who come to the office and they can't find someone to see who takes their insurance because we're not ensuring that the network is adequate to cause people to come in and take insurance. So it starts with not paying for the care. We have to develop systems for cooperative care among psychiatrists. We need force augmentation, certainly. We need to enforce mental health parity laws. We just had legislation that was passed in April to review our mental health parity laws we passed probably a decade ago, to make sure that the insurance companies we have in the state are actually following the law and spending the appropriate resources to make sure that people have access to mental health services. So it is adequate networks for insurance. It's making sure that mental health parity laws are followed. It's developing workforce and using all the people in the system for mental health to make sure that they're available and able to work. It's telemedicine bill that we passed. I heard today that in schools that will help with force augmentation, getting the child psychiatrist in the school. So there are a number of things we have to do as part of a comprehensive reform plan to address these issues that you've raised.
We also need to incentivize students who are getting their degrees and encourage them to get into this field and to make it make it worth their while to pay their student loans if they're going to work in this is an underserved area that needs to be, and that's a policy thing that needs to come from the federal government on down.
Yes, absolutely.
Yes to both of those, and some of the way in which we are attempting to address it really deals with, and I look at Senator Ziegler because of the fact that he's like the innovation king, right? It really is how can we be more innovative in technology and others, and so of course with telemedicine and a variety of others, because you're absolutely right, but that scarcity has been in existence for some time, right? So we are really digging up out of the hole in and around it, but even working with our physician groups and our physician recruitment entity, and really helping to inform them about the fact that this is a true area that we need in order to ensure that we are creating a pipeline, so working with the National Medical Legal Partnerships and others in order to ensure that we are literally not just waiting for folks that then apply to work for us, but honestly going and creating a partnership with Morehouse, as I'm doing right now, with Howard, right? So that we are literally bringing them directly back to us in the state of New Jersey, so that we have more of our families. Absolutely right. And utilizing telemedicine and telemetry in the interim.
Good evening. So my question is more related to the cost of medication and uninsurance status, et cetera. So this is something I actually found out the hard way. Being unemployed and without insurance, medication costs can get a little crazy. So one thing that I noticed that there's an inequity when it comes to daily medication that's required to take, something that I do, that I take $120, but something that I need on a as-needed basis that's more highly addictive is $12. So is there any plans to combat that inequity? Because a lot of families may need that $120 to go toward bills. So I want to know if there's anything in the future for that.
Could I ask you to have an offline conversation with my staff about that issue? Because there are things that they're looking at in terms of the cost of medications, and even Congress is looking at how to address that issue. But since this was not going to be part of this, could I ask you to, okay. Brad, could you make sure he gets to talk to somebody? Thank you. And thank you for that question.
It's an important question.
Yeah.
My name is Melvin Wilson. I'm the pastor of St. Matthew AME Church in Orange, New Jersey. And for the last 16 weeks, I've been preaching on mental health every Sunday.
Wow.
Here's the problem. Similar to what the good doctor just said. Now that I've started the conversation, opened it up, yesterday I talked about PTSD and PPSD, talked about rape and sexual assault yesterday. Now that I'm opening this up, folk can't afford to go to a therapist. They can't, their insurance doesn't cover a therapist. So are there any pots of money anywhere? I know it sounds like a very simple question, but is there money anywhere that now that people are getting honest about wanting to talk to somebody about everything they've been through, someplace that sliding scale coverage is, money somewhere where we can get culturally appropriate therapy?
So, I mean, as your church obviously being a nonprofit, I would say even going that route and looking for money for those specific individual sessions, family sessions, couples therapy, those type of services, and maybe have a mental health professional come into the church to do those sessions. There are also many different places where you can go and do sliding scales. So there is Catholic Charities. There's also places, resources like NAMI that have a list of resources where you can ask them, like, hey, can you tell us where we can get, free services or little to none, or some place that has a sliding scale. There are also outpatient facilities that do have interns. And so although they are pre-licensed professionals, they are supervised by a licensed professional and are in the middle of having their training to become a clinician. So that's always an option. I know at my agency we have interns that offer therapy for $0 to $20. And so I would maybe start, especially in the Essex County area, I would definitely reach out to some of those different places.
I was going to add, there's also a website called the Open Path Collective.
Yes.
.org, and they offer sliding scales as well. So if you go to their website, put in your geographic location, the therapist will populate. And then as well, Brittany mentioned the National Alliance on Mental Illness. They come into the church and host support groups and host mental health trainings. So that's also a solution too.
I just want to highlight the importance, though, of one of the important aspects of your question, and that is you equip people with knowledge. Now, I've had people say, well, we're doing this, but if we don't have all of this done on the back end, should we? You're hearing this for schools, and it's irritating, I have to tell you, because we have to get the screening done. That we don't have the entire thing built out doesn't mean we don't arm people with knowledge so that they can go out and get what they need. And you've been empowered here to hear about other things. But we've got to move forward with what we can do as soon as we can, and we'll build the structure as we go forward. When people got national health insurance, one of the things like, well, we're not going to have enough people to take care of people, But what happens is that gets developed as you go. As people have insurance, they will seek out and find someone to take care of them, and people will begin to hire the people they need to provide the service. This happens every time. It's not going to happen any other way, and so knowledge is power.
May I also add, for anyone who is actually in crisis, though, right? So they can, of course, immediately go to the hospital. I believe that I'm in Essex at Clara Mass Medical Center, which does happen to be in our system, but it's because of the fact that they have the PES, right? So the Psychiatric Emergency Service System is actually designated for that hospital. They can automatically receive treatment. I want to make certain that if, in fact, there's anyone who's actually in the moment of crisis, that you actually have the ability to send them somewhere. And even if they are on charity care, then of course, it is addressed. Right? They have sympathy for that. They can even be placed in intensive outpatient treatment, and they can still be a charity care patient. It's completely fine.
And the children's system care has is we have perform care. So if there's an emergency like that, they will send a mobile unit to the school, to your home, to evaluate a person in distress, to something for their to a setting of safety that can happen. They can provide services in the home, and that's done. There's no charge for that.
And Perform Care is Perform Care New Jersey or performcarenj.org. That's where you would go to get the number for crisis mobile response.
You know what I'm going to ask this panel? To share with my office all of these websites that they've been sharing here so that you can get that information from one place. All right? Thank you.
Hi, good evening. My name is Emmanuel Edmondson. I'm an ISC therapist in Burlington County, but I'm also a mental health clinician at Willington High School, and we have a youth services, school-based youth services program there, and it's one out of about 70 in New Jersey. My question is, my boss is very good about going about getting more grants, but unfortunately I'm one mental health therapist for about 700 students. Yeah. And the guidance counselors, they're working their butts off, but they're working more on, for college readiness and getting schedules and things like that together. So my question is about how to improve or increase funding for another therapist, and also for to also move them into the middle schools, because we've seen like a very big need for that, to start them off there, because we do some initiatives in order to get them familiar with us and to know that it's okay to talk about mental health. And also, lastly, I promise, the Taskforce for teachers in order to become medical trainers or to be trained. How can we go about getting that inside of our school as well?
Was that last question?
first aid.
Just about the training for the medical.
Right, you're talking about mental health first aid? Yeah, the schools really need to look into writing grants for that. You can actually go to mentalhealthfirstaid.org and it'll teach you where you can get the resources to bring mental health first aid into your communities, whether it's your schools or your healthcare providers or your social services or your faith communities. And they actually have information on where you can get resources for that so that you can bring it in and begin to train your teachers and your administrators.
Really quick for the next question, our office is more than happy to provide a follow-up email with all the resources that all our lovely panelists provided. But I do want to make sure you know, if you did not sign on the sign-in sheet, we do not have your information. So if you want that follow-up email after this is done, I do need you to sign in on the sign-in sheet. Thank you.
Hi, Christine Sanford Clark, educator in Trenton. So my question, I hear awesome about school and community partnerships and bringing these services to the students. So at the federal level, we talk about full service community school models. I would like to know, have you researched, are you interested, have you looked at, would you be willing to look at full service community school partnerships so that your services are site-based? We talked a little bit about that, but really being fully at the sites so that not only do the students have access to your service, but parents, community members, I hear the gentleman talk about at the churches, but the schools are everywhere, right? And so the parents and the families are familiar and come into the schools. So if the services were there, imagine the possibilities. So have you thought about that?
Well, yes, I mean, today in the training that the conference I attended today, this question came up, and I think there are a few community, I think they're called community schools that have this concept. California is looking at trying to fund that in the school, and in part answer to the young man's question, I believe we're going to have to make a decision about funding these services in the school. You're going to have physical plans. You're going to have the professional developed, and I think it's going to be very difficult to do that without making it a part of the funding formula for the schools. I mean, that's a lift, but if it's going to be there and guaranteed over time, you can't keep writing a grant and hope to get the funding every time. It's going to have to be part of the usual appropriation process to fund this in the schools, making sure that we do it efficiently, of course, using partners as we go. But this concept, I think, is an important one. And you raised a question about using the school, which belongs to everybody, to send these services outside of the individuals who are in the school, but the community that should be involved in the school anyway.
And I think it's important to add, especially as, a municipal representative, when we talk about home rule, the Department of Education, we can talk about, how we mandate, be it unfunded or funded. It's also really incumbent upon individuals in the community to be really active with their boards of education so they can kind of help steer that conversation and also loop in and come to council meetings. So y'all come to council meetings, please.
The concept of school-based, community-based schools is something that goes back as far as Jim Florio. And we worked on a interdepartmental task force on that issue. It never got off the ground, but it was to bring every one of those services, including housing needs, job needs, medical needs. And you're right, schools are a perfect vehicle for those because they're everywhere.
And there is federal funding with the Medicaid, CMS approved Medicaid services or Medicaid funding for those who qualify for Medicaid to be delivered in the school. But we haven't quite figured out how to do that in the school. So some of this that we need to do in the school is going to be supported by federal money. So, there's a lot of planning we need to do. We've got to plan, decide what we want to do and what we can do. Then we've got to figure out how to fund it. It's going to be a combination of federal funding and coming out of the education fund for our schools. But we've got to get that process started, plan it as best we can, and then go ahead and build it.
And implement it. The school zone is a good, a great model.
Yeah, the promised neighborhood methodology. So that there is a template for it, right? Certainly, the state of New Jersey has had school-based clinics. We still run several of them in Newark, actually, and then turn it over to George. I'm so sorry. I was just mentioning the fact that there is clearly a precedent for it in the state of New Jersey. We have had school-based clinics. They have been about physicality and not necessarily, right, your mental health, but nevertheless, right, they have existed over time. We used to run several of them. We turned them over to Jewish Renaissance, which was a fully qualified health center, and then unfortunately, eventually they closed, right? So there is undoubtedly, I think, an ever-rising need, and so I will tell you that it is something that every community is talking about right now, not just African American community. It is just that for a long time we have enjoyed the aspect of being able to say that, well, we may have a lot of things, but we don't kill ourselves, right? When the truth of the matter was that clearly it was happening over time. It is just now at pandemic proportions.
Okay, we have about 10 minutes, so we're going to ask if you can.
Good evening. Thank you for being here. My name is Reverend Dr. Carol Pierce, and I'm glad you just mentioned Perform Care because it was on my list. I work for DCF, and so I would encourage people to use Perform Care and mobile response. You made a comment, is 2 hours enough? 2 hours for 8 weeks of mobile response is not enough. It's not enough because trauma goes deep and long. And we all know that if not all of us, at least 90% of us suffer from some form of trauma. And we didn't define trauma, so I would like the panelists to define trauma so people know what trauma is, number one. We didn't necessarily define mental illness, but we know we're here for suicide, but there was no definition for mental illness. And I think that's important. And lastly, in giving you information, because you mentioned veterans, one of which I am, is that veterans have free mental health. And that mental health is extended to their families. So I would encourage people who have veterans that not only can the veteran get mental health free counseling, that their wives and their sisters and their brothers and their children, because the VA has recognized that if you just deal with the veteran and don't touch their family, you miss out on an opportunity for healing.
Thank you.
So one thing that I want to say, I know that you asked a question in regards to Perform Care, and you're absolutely right. Pre-crisis mobile, it is 8 to 12 weeks. However, when I used to work doing in-home counseling, what I would do is advocate for the child to get a higher level of care. So I would advocate for them to move over to a case management organization. In Middlesex County, I know we're in Somerset, but in Middlesex County, it's coordinated family care. So I would always advocate, and so in those case management organizations, you're actually able to get a longer span of time, about maybe 6 to 9 months for services. So I would say in those situations, absolutely making sure, that those clinicians are advocating for more time with the client. And then in regards to those definitions, in regards to trauma and mental illness, maybe we can actually talk afterwards.
I know what the definitions are, but I don't know. I work for DCF, so trust me, I know the definition. But do the people know the definition? Because if we don't know what the word means, how do we begin to, number one, identify it in ourselves so that we can affect our families towards healing?
Right, absolutely. So maybe what we could do is we can maybe put something together and send it out to everyone that is on that email list, just so that everybody's on the same page for sure with that, just for time, okay?
And this is definitely the start of the conversation. Unfortunately, it can't be a substantive, exhaustive discussion to everything we do need to cover.
I'm Reverend Dr. Deborah Stapleton, and I'm here at First Baptist, and just want to let you know that the ministers and some of the deacons here were trained through the mental health first aid, and I maintain my training. It's because that's something that you have to renew. And I just sent a note to Pastor, and he said he's going to revive it because it had died down. So I hope he hears me right. But my comment and question is, what we haven't talked about is the silence around sexuality and the stigma in our communities around transgender, gay, lesbian, and bisexual youth, and the trauma these youth experience that also lead them to being bullied and then attempting suicide. Really can't speak to the impact, because we talk about racism and the impact of racism, but sexuality right now is very high in terms of what's causing youth to commit suicide, especially in our communities, because we are so silent around that. Can you speak to that and talk about ways to broaden the conversation so that our youth begin to heal in that regard?
Actually, thank you, Dr. Stapleton. The Taskforce is looking into those issues and the intersectionality of being black and gay, being whatever. So tonight, we sort of concentrated on what we concentrated on, but the task force is definitely looking at it, and one of our esteemed work group members is a executive director of a national organization that brings those issues into focus for us. Thank you for sharing.
Good evening. My name is Imani Alexis Mitchell. My question tonight, I just wanted to know if there is a value in seeking help from a mental health professional before you recognize that there is a problem. Speaking for myself, I found out that I was depressed way later than I should have, and so my question is, like, if you don't think you have a mental health issue, or if you don't think your child has one, should you still go see someone anyway?
Yeah, I think that that's an excellent question. So there's different levels of recognition, right? So there's a level of denial where we know that something is wrong, because we know that in our gut, right? Intuitively, even if we don't have the words to vocalize it, we know intuitively in our gut when something is broken, right? So there's a sense of denial, or I feel like something's wrong, but I'm not going to address it. But then there's also not recognizing it, right? So like it took me years to recognize that I was living and functioning alcoholism until someone pointed out to me and said, you're going to lose your job if you don't get help, right? So once you start to feel that intuitively something is broken here, starts to affect the way you live, love, and laugh, then you know that you need to go and get help. Even if you don't have the vocabulary, if you say, I don't know if this is anxiety, is this depression, is it worry, you want to be able to go to a mental health therapist the same way you would go to the dentist if you had a toothache. So yes, as soon as you begin to feel like something is broken in you, you're not functioning the way you would normally function, you absolutely want to talk to somebody so that you can head off that potential crisis.
Well, you raise an important issue, about that some 50% of African Americans don't know that they have mental illness. They are not diagnosed. Part of it's access to care, but there is a disparity just in diagnosis. Know that the schools, and it's one of the things we need to look as we think about school-based interventions, that there is a group that does social and emotional learning, and this is across the school system to teach children how to understand their own emotions, how to deal with them, how to do conflict resolution, how to seek help if they feel like something's going amiss. And this needs to be part of the curriculum. The forward-leaning schools are doing this. I understand that a number of teachers are getting this training across the school systems, and we need to monitor that and make sure that every child, I think, has access to this kind of curriculum. There's legislation in the states requiring this training for high schoolers. Oh, if we integrate it in the curriculum, we might go a long way to dealing with the problem you're raising.
And we have about 2 more minutes. I'm sorry.
Yes is the answer. Yes. Yes is the answer to the question. We all should be in therapy. Talking to someone is
even if you don't have a diagnosable mental illness, therapy is not just for those who have a mental illness. It's for everybody.
Hi, good evening. Thank you all for coming out tonight. Just a real quick comment. Sir, you had mentioned during your talk that children, boys in particular, 8, 10 years old, are sometimes required to take on the roles of a 17 or even a 20-year-old. Consider this. In other groups, if I'm Jewish, I have a bar mitzvah, or bat mitzvah. If I am, Catholic, maybe I have a confirmation. When our boys are 13, in other cultures, they're already an adult. They know a role, they're accepted into society. What do we have for the 12, 13-year-old African-American male to tell him, now, a rite of passage, that's my word. There needs to be a panel, we're all wonderful, get on it. It's going to take work, it's going to take money, but there should be something that our boys have to look forward to. At 12, 13, 18, this is your role, this is who you are, and this is the expectation that we have for you, not the prison. Thank you.
Thank you. So, my name is Dr. Magdalene Cherry. I'm a primary care doctor in South Jersey. My question is about culturally competent care. So, what I find is a lot of times patients of color will come to me and say, finally I feel comfortable talking to you and saying something to you. So the numbers don't lie. We don't have enough people of color who are in medicine, as physicians, as mental health professionals. So we have to rely on other people from other backgrounds to also support the community. Is there anything the task force has for training people to be culturally competent and what it looks like in minorities and blacks and Hispanics? I find that's the biggest barrier, and people just want to give medications. And also just training the community to understand that mental health also looks like obesity, hypertension, alcoholism, because a lot of times what happens is that my patients will come to me and they came from the hospital, literally had a heart attack, and we go through everything, the tests are negative, and I'm like, okay, so tell me what's going on at home. Something else is happening that we're missing here, and again, that also stands to cultural competency. I'm a black woman. I was raised in a black family, in a black community. I know what that looks like, but my counterparts and my colleagues don't. So then people like myself, we get burnt out, right? And we don't even have enough time, like the other doctor talked about. We have 15 minutes to be able to talk about this all in one visit. So is there anything for that for other clinicians and other centers?
So the task force has only been in existence 3 months. And what you talked about is something that is a very important issue for us, this whole issue of having someone that you can relate to when you're seeking therapy or help or whatever. So that's on our radar as well. This has been this has been amazing. Has it not been amazing? Your questions have been amazing. Our panel has been so generous with your time and with your knowledge and with your sharing. And we're going to try very hard to get the information that was shared here tonight, make it available to you, the websites. Bear with us. This is an emergency task force. The underlying premise is that we're not going to be here all day long for years. We've got to come up with our findings, our recommendations, our suggestions, our solutions, whether they're grants, funding, legislation, policy, whatever. We hope to have something out by the end of the year. And so thank you for coming out here and sharing with us tonight and listening. And to each of you, you just bless me. Thank you so much.
We're not well yet.